On the waterfront, a potential hazard is constantly on the move. From a distance, the cargo may look harmless enough. An ordinary container, a common-looking black drum. If you're not one to look closely at labels, you might miss an important clue, something that could save your life. There are times when a colored label, a number, and a symbol indicate that the materials you're handling are deadly killers. In a world where safety just happens, your awareness of placards and labels identifying hazardous materials wouldn't be important. If a ruptured tank containing flammable fluid leaked all over the ground, it wouldn't be a problem. The deadly substance wouldn't cause harm to you, other workers, or the environment. In the real world, safety doesn't just happen. If you're not aware of the materials you're handling, if you don't look at placards or labels, if you fail to notice a container releasing hazardous chemicals, the results could be devastating. This program will show you how you can foresee your safety when transporting and handling hazardous materials on the waterfront. You'll recognize the types of substances that are considered hazardous and dangerous. You'll learn to identify these materials and their hazard classifications by recognizing placards, labels, and other documentation. You'll learn how to recognize and report potential hazards in your workplace. You'll be aware of some recent global changes in how vital information is presented in labels and safety data sheets. And you'll identify your responsibilities in the event of a spill or release.
There's been a has spill. There's been a has spill.
Materials that are classified as hazardous are necessary for many things we use on a daily basis. These materials fuel our vehicles, fertilize our crops, improve manufacturing and medicine, and perform various other jobs. But they can pose a risk to health or safety when they're transported by commercial means. Hazardous materials are shipped under strict federal and international guidelines to ensure that they're packaged safely, identified easily, and handled properly. Even though they may be packed safely, if hazardous materials are released, or if they combine with other materials, they can do a great amount of harm in a short time. The kinds of hazards associated with these materials include fire, explosion, poisoning, radiation exposure, infection, or burns. Releases of hazardous materials can be controlled by professionals with the proper equipment. Under no circumstances should you try to control these materials on your own. Whenever hazmat or hazardous materials are transported, they must be accompanied by documentation. Placards are large signs that are attached to the vehicle cargo container carrying the hazardous material. They provide information about the type of hazard the material poses. The information is communicated in 4 ways: the placard color, the symbol, the United Nations Identification Number, or UNID, and the hazard class, also indicated by the number. Materials designated as hazardous by the United States Department of Transportation, or DOT, fall into distinct categories or classes. The color and symbol work together to identify the type of hazard. Red, for example, shows that a material is a flammable liquid or gas, while orange identifies an explosive material. The UNID indicates the specific material within the container. For example, the UNID 1203 identifies gasoline. The hazard class describes the category into which each hazard falls. Let's look at these individually. There are 9 classes of hazards. Explosives are hazard class 1. These are materials that can be set off by shock, heat, electricity, or even radio signals. The division number indicates the type of explosive hazard, such as 1.1, that would be explosives with a mass explosion hazard, or 1.3, explosives with a fire hazard. Gases are hazard class 2 and can present several different hazards. They may be flammable, such as acetylene, or poison gases such as chlorine. Flammable liquids are in hazard class 3. Vapors from these liquids ignite easily under normal conditions. Class 4 hazards are flammable solids, such as sodium metal or phosphorus. These materials are readily combustible when exposed to air or water. Oxidizers are Class 5 hazards. These materials are not flammable on their own, but they can either release or supply enough oxygen to a fire to make them extremely dangerous by burning hotter and faster. Class 6 hazards or poisons are materials other than gases that are known to be toxic to humans. These materials may be liquids, or they may fill the air as dust or powder and can be inhaled. Class 6 hazards also include infectious materials, such as medical waste. Class 7 hazards are materials that give off ionizing radiation. These materials can cause damage at the cellular level. Organ failure or cancer can result, even with short exposure times. Corrosive liquids are Class 8 hazards. These materials, such as strong acids, can destroy human skin in a short time and also damage metals such as steel and aluminum. Miscellaneous hazards in Class 9 don't meet the definition of any other hazard class. These include materials that produce irritating or toxic gases when burned, or liquids that produce dangerous vapors. Spray cans and car airbags, which use nitrogen as the inflation gas, are a common Class 9 hazard. Labels are attached to material packaging, such as a bottle, cylinder, box, or drum. The first type of label looks similar to the placards, with the symbol, color, and hazard class. But each container also has labels with more detailed information about the chemicals and their potential risks. These labels may look different from what you've been used to. This is because the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, has adopted the globally harmonized system, GHS, of classification and labeling of chemicals. This new standard requires chemical manufacturers and importers to print hazard information on labels in a standard format that is now used in many countries. These labels include a signal word, pictogram, hazard statement, and precautionary statement for each hazard class and category. This will make it easier for you to quickly identify which chemicals are being handled and understand the potential risk. The Dangerous Cargo Manifest is a document that identifies all of the hazardous materials being transported on a vessel. It contains the shipping name and the identification number of each hazardous material on board, as well as an emergency response telephone number. In addition, the Dangerous Cargo Manifest lists the amount of each material, the type of packaging it's in, its classification according to DOT regulation, and its location on the vessel. The Dangerous Cargo Manifest is important if there's an emergency on the vessel, such as a fire, so that potential hazards can be identified and handled quickly by emergency personnel. If your job involves handling dangerous cargo, your employer will let you know the type of hazard you're dealing with and let you know about any special handling instructions that may be necessary. Safety data sheets, or SDS, for these materials can be requested from the employer. Safety doesn't just happen when you're working around dangerous and hazardous materials, and a hazmat incident can have widespread effects. Stay focused and aware of your surroundings. If you see a fresh stain or puddle near a container with a hazmat placard or label on it, you should suspect a release. If you see these signs, you should assume there is more than just a liquid present. There may be a potential dangerous effect along with it, such as vapors that could ignite or poisonous fumes. If packaging within the container breaks, you may notice a discoloration of the container from heat or corrosion. If gas is present, you may notice an odor. In the case of some gases, there may be no odor, but you'll notice other effects, such as burning in your nose and mouth, dizziness, nausea, or drowsiness. No matter what signs you see or symptoms you feel, if you suspect there's been a hazmat release, don't try to contain it yourself. Leave the area immediately and notify supervision. Don't call for help on your own cell phone. Communicate the situation clearly and concisely to supervision so everyone will know there is a problem. Your employer has an emergency action plan in place for spills, releases, and other emergency events. Make sure you're familiar with the plan and know how to find the evacuation areas. Remember, your only responsibility is to get away from the hazard and report the problem. Once you have reported the hazmat release, wait for instructions and follow them. Hazardous chemicals can be especially lethal when combined with confined spaces. A confined space is large enough for someone to enter and has a limited opening for entry and exit, and isn't intended for continuous human occupancy. These spaces should be clearly marked at your workplace. On the waterfront, confined spaces include hatches, passageways, crane legs, storm drains, or electrical vaults. If dangerous substances get into these spaces, a hazardous atmosphere could be created. That's why you should heed the warnings and never enter a confined space. These spaces should only be accessed under the direction of your employer. If you're directed to enter a confined space, your employer will provide the proper training, permits, and PPE. Knowledge is your greatest defense against all hazardous materials. OSHA has created a Hazard Communication, or HAZCOM, standard, which requires your workplace to keep you informed about the hazardous materials you work with or handle. The regulation also requires your workplace to provide you with information on preventing exposure to these materials and requires you to notify supervision of any leaks or spills that you see. If your job requires you to work with hazardous materials, you'll get special training on proper handling, use, and disposal of those materials from your direct employer. If you're using these chemicals in consumer quantities that don't qualify as spill or release hazards, federal law requires you to handle and dispose of hazardous materials using approved methods. If you work around hazardous materials as part of your job, for example, in the maintenance shop, you may want to know some important facts about them. The Safety Data Sheet, or SDS, is supplied by the chemical manufacturer and is available through your workplace. It will be replacing the Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS. Under the new GHS standards, all safety data sheets will have a standardized format with 16 specific sections. This will make it easier for you to quickly find the information you need. The SDS contains vital information about the material, including its generic name, physical characteristics, and normal state. The SDS also describes the type of hazard the material poses and the conditions that make it hazardous, such as heat or exposure to other materials. The SDS contains information on the material's effects on the human body, and it lists emergency or first aid measures to take if a person has been exposed to the material. It also describes the actions to take in case of a leak or spill. If you work around hazardous materials, your employer will have an SDS available for each one. Don't wait until there's an emergency. Read it before you need it. If you don't know where you can get a particular SDS, ask supervision. Hazardous materials serve important roles in making our lives better, and they make up a large part of what you handle on the docks. But there is the threat of a spill or release. Even small spills and releases can cause harm to the environment, the community, and to life itself. You have a right and a need to know what you're handling, and the responsibility to handle these materials properly. If you make safety your priority, you can make safety happen.